everyone, welcome to the final exam review. My name is Elise Hansen again, and I hope this helps. It's a little rushed, just gonna warn you, but hopefully you still get something out of it. Okay, so this review is split up into 4 sections, starting with the people that are important to this unit. So the 2 really important people are John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. John Muir advocated for preservation. He took the environment from the theocentric perspective, and he wanted to save the environment purely for its beauty, while Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, had more of the utilitarian perspective, whatever benefits the greater good. He believed in sustainability and saving the environment for human use, but not so much for the environment itself, like with Muir. So I have this political cartoon here of Teddy Roosevelt with Gifford Pinchot, and another important fact to know is that Teddy Roosevelt was a part of the hunters who started that concern for environmentalism, because their thinking was, well, if there's no animals left for us to hunt, then we won't be able to hunt anymore, which I guess is a little smart in itself, but also a little self-serving. So he's saying he's good enough for me because he believes in sustainability, not so much keeping the environment for everything in the world, just that anthropocentric view. Remember, anthropocentric, that's the humans first view, was the most important for them. Okay, Aldo Leopold. If you remember from the documentary The Fierce Green Fire, he was the hunter who shot the wolf and saw the fierce green fire in her eyes before she died, and that inspired him to start caring about the environment, so he wrote the Sand County Almanac. And he also established the idea of the land ethic, which is just treating the environment in terms of right and wrong, so ethics, and we must consider those ethics when we're treating our ecosystems. He also founded the Wilderness Society, and that's really what's important about him. He wrote the land ethic. He wrote the Sand County Almanac. He established the land ethic of what's right and wrong when it comes to ecosystems, so know that. David Brower. He became the executive director of the Sierra Club from 1952 to 1962. He sort of just came in and changed the club from being just a hiking club to an environmental concern club. Later on, he was kind of kicked out from that position because he got a little bit too radical, and we're not going to go into that, a little bit too political. All you need to know is that later on he founded the Friends of the Earth and the Earth Island Institute so he could continue to help the environment because he really cared about it. That was his biggest concern. Another important part of David Brower's life is that when he first became the executive director of the Sierra Club, he decided to tackle this problem. They were trying to make a dam in the Grand Canyon, and he was not going to let that stand. So finally he reached a compromise with people who wanted to make the dam and said, all right, you guys can have Glen Canyon, which he hadn't seen before, if we get to keep Grand Canyon. Later on, he just was kicking himself for giving up Glen Canyon because he saw it, and it was beautiful, of course, and had its own beauty to it, apart from the Grand Canyon, and he really regretted that he conceded that canyon for the Grand Canyon. But, it's in the past, it's in the past. Lastly, on David Brower, he helped the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964. And that's all about David Brower. As you can see, really the most important thing is the Grand Canyon thing. He really played an instrumental role in saving the Grand Canyon. It sucks that he had to lose the Glen Canyon with it, but what's the worst that could happen? Okay, section 2 is places that are important for this exam. We're starting with Love Canal, and this little picture is kind of ironic because Love Canal, as we all know, is really not that beautiful because of the terrible toxic and chemical waste, the 21,000 tons of toxic waste that were buried beneath the neighborhood that was leading these poor kids to get diseases and birth defects and have a hard time learning at school. And this is another case of classic environmentalism where the moms of the community decided, you know what, we're not going to let our kids grow up and in this terrible environment where they're getting all these diseases and getting so sick and not being able to learn, and they all came together and they did some pretty crazy stuff. Like the EPA came down and they held the EPA officers hostage until the president finally agreed, President Jimmy Carter at the time, to come on down and relocate them, at least temporarily, so they could get rid of all the toxic waste. And another important part of this is that's when the Superfund was established. The Superfund was established in 1980. It was a fund created by Congress to clean up hazardous waste sites, and the money from the fund comes from taxing chemical products. Okay, people are not too happy with the Superfund because it's only cleaned up 319 sites of over 1,600 sites that still need to be cleaned. And it's just been years and years that they haven't done anything about some of these places. For example, in Libby, Montana, this is a town that was infested by asbestos 18 years ago that has still, nothing has happened. Nothing's come out of it, and this is a Superfund town that was supposed to be helped. And it's kind of sad. But what can we do? Just important to know for the exam, I suppose. Okay, now we're going to talk about copper mines. We're going to talk about the existing copper mine in Bingham Canyon, which is known for lots of toxin releases. The primary toxin that is released is sulfuric acid, and then a couple other examples are selenium and arsenic. There's a 22-mile plume of contaminated groundwater, and that is just, if that's not pathetic, I don't know what is. But we do need to discuss the pros of copper for the capitalists out there. And the pros, I suppose, are 11,900 people employed in this mine, and that there's a really high demand for copper. But this is one of those environmental conundrum situations. If you don't know what an environmental conundrum situation is, it's sometimes you want to just get rid of something that's a bad habit, but the alternative is kind of bad too. So we can say, well, let's get rid of copper. But then it's like, but we need copper. So it's hard. That's a conundrum. Okay, and lastly, on the slide, I had to make a meme so it could be a little more interesting and not just, text upon text. And we have Michael Scott from The Office saying, "Copper, I hardly know her." Okay, I'm just going to move on. Okay, the Rosemont proposed copper mine. This proposed mine, it would put 12 endangered and threatened species at risk, but it promises lots of jobs and revenue. So that is something that is being advocated for the people who want the mine. And then, of course, we do need copper, so the fact that there is copper here, because you can't just mine copper wherever. It's only in some places. We can't just, pick some random part of Arizona and be like, yeah, let's mine for copper. This is actually in Arizona, but, this is a location with copper. And another important thing to know about this mine is it is putting a travel corridor for the leopard. It might be a jaguar. I don't know. I get them confused. El Jefe at risk. We did learn about that in class, so I hope you remember him. He was cute and cool, and it would be really sad if he didn't get to use his usual migration pattern because of a proposed copper mine. Okay, our third section is what I've called the Gov and Econ section, throwback to senior year of high school, because there are a lot of terms and things on this exam that have to do with the government and economics. Okay, first we're going to talk about concentrated and diffuse interests. Concentrated interests have fewer members in them, there's greater ease of communication, and there's a direct financial interest in government action, so they're typically more effective. Diffuse interests are shared by wide ranges of citizens. They expect non-financial benefits, which make them less attentive to the problems that they're concerned about. And what's important to know about this is part of the biggest challenges that environmentalists face. And that's because the big oil companies have concentrated interests where they only want one thing, and that is to make as much money as possible off of the fossil fuels, the oil that they are producing. And so that's all they have to worry about. But with diffuse interests, which is what most environmentalists are about, is they care about a lot of things. It's not just oil that's a problem. It's coal, and it's other problems in the world like biodiversity, climate change, clean water, clean air. The list goes on. There's just so many things to worry about, and it's really hard to fight against people who only care about one thing when the environmentalists care about such a large plethora of things. Okay, pluralism, interest groups, and nonprofits. Pluralism is the role of government as a referee in the competition among private interests. Interest groups are groups that lobby the government for things they want. Examples of these are the NRA and the Sierra Club. Nonprofits are civil society organizations, we'll go over civil society in the next slide, whose mission is not centered around earning money. So the examples are not the NRA and the Sierra Club. So interest groups can be nonprofits and vice versa. Right over here, I have this picture of Ronald Reagan and like George H.W. Bush, RIP, in a meme that says, interest group thought that they can influence our government. That should say thought that they could influence our government. This is not my meme. I do not take credit for this. I found it off of the internet. It's kind of true and not true at the same time, because clearly the NRA can influence our government, but I don't know if the Sierra Club can as much. Whoops, that was too political. Let's move on. Okay, civil society, as I said in the last slide, externalities and social costs. Civil society is an umbrella term for social activities happening outside of governmental institutions and outside of profit-making activity. So that's just us living our lives like normal people. And, you know, our lives can be threatened in the civil society by things that are caused by profit-making organizations and the government institutions. Externalities are real consequences that are not considered a market transaction, and as I put, it bites you in the butt later on because of social costs, and these are costs inflicted by externalities. So an example of an externality would be pollution. It's a negative one. There could be positive ones too, but if there's being a ton of pollution and people are getting like lung problems from breathing in improper air while they're going out and working, then they have to take a leave from work for a while, and of course it's a lot less efficient that way, and honestly less work ends up getting done in the end for that maybe the same company that was causing the pollution in the first place. So it's important to keep externalities in mind, but a lot of people don't. A lot of corporations. Market failure and third-party effects. Market failure is a set of actual or potential transactions in which externalities are ignored. As a result, these decisions to produce or to consume a good or service are made in response to erroneous signals, and these market failures, they inhibit the provision of desirable things such as research, and they encourage overuse of other things. So that's really not good. Market failure is caused by not looking at the externalities. Externalities are so important. Third-party effects are intended or unintended impacts on economic decisions that fall on people who are not party to them transactions. So, for example, as Dr. Argandonia said today in class, like in Ecuador, there are bike riders on the streets, but all the cars drive on diesel. So if a big car drives past a bike rider and they're a diesel-run car, then a bunch of smoke might get into the bike rider's face, and it's kind of not fair because the bike rider wasn't driving that car. They're just biking and trying to live their life, but now they're probably going to have health problems in the future because of that. So right here I have this meme. So it says, don't protect the environment to save business and the economy. I made this one, and it's because the biggest argument we always hear is, well, we shouldn't worry about the environment. We shouldn't do things like enforce the Clean Air Act because that's bad for the economy. Well, as we see here, there are clearly some effects on the economy that happen when we don't protect the environment. So that's some food for thought, that maybe business and economy thrive in better environments and actually end up failing in worse environments, like physical environment of the world. Okay, important terms, third section. We're almost at our last one. Precautionary principle. If there is a good reason to believe that any action may harm humans/the environment, those who advocate for that action should bear the burden of proof to demonstrate that risks are acceptable. Wow, I wish everybody followed the precautionary principle. As we know, in like the UK, they do, for example, we heard that story in class where there was a good 3 days where they were like living in this cloud of smog and a bunch of people died. So that was a product of coal, just overconsumption of coal. So the government decided, you know what, we're going to stop using so much coal because people are dying. We're going to, here's the burden of proof. All these people died and we were living in this really freaky cloud for 3 days and we don't want that to happen again. So the risks are not acceptable. We're going to do something about it. The United States, on the other hand, according to this political cartoon, we in government believe in the precautionary principle, never stand in the way of a mega corporation that's about to make a killing from potentially harmful products. The United States tends to prioritize business as a part of our free market perspective on things. So as we see, that in the end, honestly, is probably just going to make things worse because of market failure. Everything connects. Market failure because we avoid those externalities of people being affected by pollution and not being able to come to the work that caused the pollution. It all fits together. I hope that makes sense. cap and trade. So we're not going to go too into this. We're just going to try to understand it because it's very complicated. The cap sets a limit on emissions, which is lowered over time to reduce the amount of pollutants released into the atmosphere. This is established to help combat climate change. And then the trade creates a market for carbon allowances, helping companies innovate in order to meet or come in under their allocated limit. The less they emit, the less they pay. So there's this economic incentive to pollute less. That doesn't mean that anybody is feeling incentivized. But as was said in class today, why are we incentivizing people to pollute less? Shouldn't people have to pay for polluting more? It just seems kind of not fair. But this was established to try to stop climate change, to try to help reverse those effects. But people are kind of unsure as to how effective it has actually been. The revenue that has been made off of this program has contributed to some other really good programs, but other than that, there have not really been many positive or negative effects. There was this rumor that gas prices were going to go up because of this cap and trade thing, but that didn't happen. So I don't know if that's considered positive or not, because that was a hypothetical, honestly, but doesn't matter. Hopefully you just understand what cap and trade is, because that's what you'll need to know for the exam. Okay, cradle to cradle and cradle to grave. Cradle to cradle is designing a product with its end in mind, and this is making sure that it's possibly degradable or can be recycled or reused. But cradle to grave is manufactured to be disposed, so it's only useful one time. Cradle to grave just causes like pile up in landfills, and it's really not a sustainable way of designing manufactured things. So there wasn't really any means for this, and as I said, I was kind of rushed, so I didn't really have time to make that many. So just to brighten up your day, here's Michael Scott from The Office saying, I'm not robbing the cradle. If anything, I'm robbing the grave. So it just said cradle and grave. Like, I didn't want you guys to be bored, take a little break from the hardcore studying. Not that environmental science is boring. It's very interesting, but I understand. Legitimate coercion. So what legitimate coercion is, as we all remember from like the first unit, tragedy of the commons can only be solved by mutual coercion. So that's everybody agreeing to say, all right, we're going to do our part. We're not going to overuse the resources we have. We're all going to take a fair share. But the honor system doesn't always work, as we all know. So that's when legitimate coercion steps in. And basically that's just mutual coercion, but backed by laws. That's how we manage our resources, the commons, and pass laws. Okay, this is another meme. I sadly didn't make this one, but it's really good. It says, you don't have tragedy of commons if you don't have commons. So that's true, and I think the business people need to keep that in mind, because we can't do anything without our commons of the earth. We're going to move on to the golden rule of environmentalism, and this is just, you need to know the definition, and that is to do unto nature so as to respect the biotic community, a community that includes ourselves. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Just like treat others how you like to be treated is the real golden rule. Treat the environment how you'd like the environment to treat you. So I'm sure most of us would rather we did not live in a world of hurricanes and wildfires, and that's only going to happen if we treat the environment properly by not sending out a bunch of carbon emissions and burning a bunch of fossil fuels. This is our last section, yay! History and justice. So we're going to talk about the first Earth Day, which was in 1970, and this was a response to this just a combination of different things. The Santa Barbara oil spill that had happened that previous year, pictures of the Earth from space. That was the first time that people had seen what the Earth looked like. People had just seen, what you see when you're walking around, but people didn't know what it looked like. We grew up knowing what the Earth looked like, and up until 1970, people did not. A written work that inspired the first Earth Day was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which is about the pesticides killing a lot of the animals because of indirect consumption of those pesticides. And then lastly, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. That's just crazy. If you don't have an Earth Day after a river catching on fire, I don't know when you're going to have one. And now we're going to talk about some important policies set in place by Richard Nixon, actually. The Clean Air and Water Act were not established by Richard Nixon, but they were strengthened by him. The EPA was established by him, and I believe the Endangered Species Act also was. It's surprising because I think a lot of people think of Nixon as the terrible president who resigned from office for being corrupt and Watergate and everything, but people fail to remember that he actually did a lot of good for the environment. He sort of kept that ball rolling of making sure we protect our environment, and by doing all these awesome things like establishing the EPA. What's important to know about the Endangered Species Act actually is that There are 5 factors to be listed as an endangered species, and the first one is habitat damage or destruction. The second one is overutilization of the species. Third is disease or predation. 4, inadequacy of existing protection. And the fifth one, other natural or man-made factors that affect the continued existence of the species. Another important thing to know about the Endangered Species Act is that a practical use of it is if people are thinking of developing or building, people who are against those developments can use the Endangered Species Act to see, well, okay, there's this endangered tortoise there, you can't build there. But there are some levels to which people can use take, which is defined as making sure you just remove all of those endangered species and putting them in a safer place if you want to build something there, but making sure that there's a sustainable place for them to stay. Okay, National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA. The most important thing about NEPA is that it requires the public's role. It establishes the legal foundation requiring federal agencies to consider all actions and programs utilizing a systematic interdisciplinary approach to evaluate environmental effects of a proposed action. So the public really have to step up, like it says here, having your voice heard and say, well, I actually don't want another coal factory to open up or another oil drilling place to open up because that might cause my kids to have birth defects, and the climate change will get worse because of greenhouse gas effect. 2 things that environmental justice brings together. It's social justice and environmental problem solving. So really easy, just remember that, honestly. And another thing that I think is important to note here, because we're talking about social justice and people solving problems, is another important term for the test, which is free riders. I think of free riders as a freeloader. A freeloader would live in your house, not pay any rent, eat all your food, and a free rider does the same thing to the environment. They benefit from clean air or other improved environmental conditions while paying less than a fair share of the cost. So don't be a free rider or a freeloader. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope it helped, and happy studying, and you're going to ace all your finals.